there's a mythological trope that I discuss fairly frequently about rescuing your father from the belly of the dragon or the belly of the beast. It's a motif that you see. Well, you see it in The Lion King. You see it when Simba is being initiated by the baboon. I don't remember, Nafiki, I think his name is. After Nala humiliates him because he's still a pathetic adolescent, he follows the baboon, I think it's a mandrill actually, down underground essentially through a long tunnel. There's a lot of kind of scary music in the background, and he ends up contemplating himself in a dark pool, and then his father appears in the sky. And so that's one example of the reconstruction of the mythology of encountering your father in the abyss. You look into the abyss and you see your father. And then in the Pinocchio story, Pinocchio, of course, when he's trying to become a genuine human being, instead of a marionette pulled by other people's strings, or a neurotic, or a liar, or a jackass, because those are his alternate destinies, he goes down to the darkest place he can find, the bottom of the ocean, and finds the biggest monster he can look at, and inside he finds his father, and then rescues him. And the question is, why do you find your father when you look into the abyss? And I really do think I figured this out, and it's quite exciting to me. It's such a brilliant image. So we know as clinicians, and also I would say as sensible people, but there's good clinical documentation of this, that if you find out, imagine someone's pursuing a goal, and some of the things they have to accomplish or confront on the way to that goal frighten them, and they start to avoid, and then they get more afraid, and of course their ability to pursue their goal or to accomplish their goal deteriorates because they're avoiding. If you're a psychotherapist or even a friend or a supportive loved one, let's say, you're going to encourage the person to face the challenges that are making them afraid, to face them voluntarily. And what happens as a consequence of that is that the person usually is able to overcome those fears and develop the necessary skills and to prevail. And that's partly because, not so much because they get less afraid, but because they get more skilled and more courageous. And so imagine that if you bite off a little more than you can chew, you get stronger as a consequence. And you do that in the gym, for example. When you go lift weights, you lift weights that are a little heavier all the time. And as a consequence, you develop yourself physically and you turn into who you could be. You turn into more than you are. Okay, so if you face fears a little bit at a time, fears and challenges, and you do that voluntarily, then you become more than who you are. Okay, now let's recast that in archetypal language and make it into a kind of ultimate. So if you want to become everything that you could be, then you look into the abyss itself, which is the darkest place that you can possibly contemplate. And that would be the terror of mortality and insanity and of suffering and of malevolence, all of those. It would be like looking into hell, I suppose, to some degree. And then by voluntarily doing that, then you call upon the strongest part of yourself to respond. And the strongest part of yourself is symbolized as the sleeping father nested inside the beast. And so the fundamental truth when you look into an abyss is that you don't see the abyss if you look long enough. It's like an answer to Nietzsche's conundrum. If you look long enough into an abyss, then the abyss looks into you. It's like, well, if you look long enough into an abyss, past when the abyss looks into you, you see who you could become in the form of the great ancestral figures nested inside the catastrophe of life. And then you can join them, so to speak. You can incorporate that and become stronger. And you do that partly by taking on the challenge voluntarily. And that informs you because you learn when you take on challenges voluntarily. But you also do that as a consequence of psychophysiological transformation, because when you place yourself in challenging situations, let's say the abyss is the archetype of the ultimately challenging situation, then you turn on new genes in your nervous system and in your body that code for new proteins, and you build new structures inside of you. And none of that's going to happen without the demand that's placed on you by willing to confront the full terror of life. And so then I would say the full terror of life is something like the reality of suffering and death and the ever-present and the ever-looming presence of malevolence in your own heart and in the heart of other people. So it's evil and suffering. And to confront that is really, well, you risk blindness by confronting that. That's also a very old story. You risk damaging your vision. But if you do it forthrightly, then you discover who you could be as a consequence. And who you could be is the solution to malevolence and suffering.